Okay, well, this Mind and Reality conference at Columbia has been a very interesting one for me. I have been on a number of these dialogues between Buddhism and science. And one of the interesting things about this particular Mind and Reality dialogue is that the multiple levels at which the conversation between the modern science and philosophy on the one hand, Western science and philosophy on the one hand, and Buddhist contemplative tradition on the other hand has taken place. We began with a very broad kind of philosophical framework, and I can probably call it at the level of worldview, comparing two intellectual traditions, so if I can call, or investigative traditions is probably a better word. So science and Western philosophy represents one investigative tradition with a long history and culture. And on the other, you have the Buddhist contemplative tradition, which also represents an investigative tradition with a very long history, not just of practice, but also of philosophical thinking, scientific form of inquiry, and so on. So Owen, in his keynote, wonderfully mapped out the kind of this broad framework and situated the whole conference as a dialogue between these two investigative traditions. And one thing that I really like about that approach is to really, instead of trying to always find commonality, and so that we can be nice to each other and polite to each other, to raise both intellectual challenges. And quite often, when there are challenges and disagreements, this is where fruitful dialogues can take place. Because the fact that there are certain operative assumptions in the Western scientific philosophical traditions may say something about the tradition, in its from a historical, social, cultural point of view. Similarly, the fact that there are certain operative assumptions in Buddhist tradition, at least in the self-understanding of the traditions, may something very unique about the historical, social, cultural context of this particular investigative tradition. So framing the dialogue in this very large setting really sets up this tone so that the people are free to engage at a very deep philosophical conceptual level, but also at a very practical research programmatic level as well. Well, my own participation at many of these similar type of conferences in the past have been mainly confined to my role as the interpreter for His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And but I believe, and also this is his wish, that this dialogue between Buddhism and science is not just personalized and confined to him alone. And he says in his book that came out recently, The Universe in a Single Atom, that although his conversation began as a curiosity of an individual person, but later he realized that in his engagement between Buddhism and science, there was basically a cultural encounter taking place between two important cultures of human civilization. So he is very keen to see that people accept that this is not just a conversation between the Dalai Lama on the one hand, an important figure of the Tibetan tradition, and scientist on the other, but rather it's a kind of a representation of a dialogue between two investigative traditions. So he is encouraging that the younger generation of Tibetan Buddhist monks, particularly the monastic community, should really take up on this suggestion. And therefore he has made efforts to introduce systematic scientific education in the monastic curriculum. And it has now been about 5 years since systematic program of science education was introduced, albeit to a selected students at this point. But his hope is that gradually there will be greater interest. And interestingly, the Dalai Lama does not see this as introduction of some kind of alien subjects into the monastic curricula. He sees this as a kind of a natural extension of Buddhist development of Buddhist thought. Because historically, if you look at the development of Buddhist philosophical tradition in ancient India, where it has gone through the greatest development is when it has engaged actively in debate with other traditions, intellectual and philosophical traditions around Buddhism. So similarly, His Holiness sees the introduction of science and the dialogue with science as a kind of a natural extension of this Buddhist, philosophical journey. And his basic motivation is very ethical. And in fact, he brings that up front. He says, look, the central objective, underlying the Buddhist quest for knowledge is the elevation of suffering. And this is really the first principle, if there is one, in Buddhism. And since, the Buddhists also believe that much of our problem and suffering arises from false understanding of reality, then the study of science and scientific insights becomes a kind of a moral requirement for the Buddhists to really understand, to have a better understanding of the physical world that we live in. Yes, I think it's very important when a dialogue such as this takes place that the participants keep in mind that it is not just a dialogue among individuals who are gathered here, but also it is a dialogue, between two investigative traditions, which has, its own history, cultural context, and so on. And given that when it comes to understanding the nature of reality, whether it is mental or physical, science naturally has a dominant position in the modern world. So taking that into account, I think it's particularly important on the part of the more dominant partner in this dialogue, namely scientists and Western philosophers, to really give voice to the tradition. And the intellectual etiquette really demands a mutual respect, which means that one has to take seriously the tradition's own self-understanding. Now, it may turn out at the end that some aspects of the traditional self-understanding may be not accurate, but still one has to respect that. At least the benefit of the doubt has to be given to the tradition's own self-representation. But what would be important on the part of the native Buddhists, if I can use the word, is to have a greater degree of critical self-awareness, so that they are more sophisticated, so that they are able to see within their own tradition which part are normative theories, in other words, this is the ideal situation, and which part are more related to the actual techniques, or whether it is meditation or mental training or whatever, and which aspects of the claim may be more empirically based. So on the part of the Buddhist scholars themselves and contemplatives, there needs to be a greater degree of critical self-awareness. So it is, and hopefully in future there will be part of the problem. One of the problems is the language. Many of the scholars who are brought up in the traditional monasteries, they don't have mastery of English or any other European languages, which makes it very difficult for them to participate. But now there are, for example, there's a group of monks going through a special program at a monastery in Zurich, near Zurich. It's a Tibetan Buddhist monastery. There's a Science for Monks program that's going on. So in the process, hopefully they will also master the language. They attend some courses at the Zurich University as well. So hopefully new generations will emerge. Well, one thing that was for me very intriguing was Susan Carey's reference to the discovery of core knowledge of intentional agency, even among newly born infants, the ability to really distinguish between intentional agents and mechanical objects. So that is, of course, I don't exactly know how the proof, what kind of evidences have been presented and how are these evidences interpreted. But given that this is an empirical claim, if it is true, that would mean quite a substantial kind of not modification, but kind of rethinking of certain standard distinctions drawn between perception and conception in Buddhist epistemology, which is very old, goes back to 6th, 7th century. So that was a very interesting moment for me, trying to figure out how it would fit within this Buddhist seemingly complete epistemological picture. Yes, this discovery of from the development psychology of the child's possession of core knowledge of intentional agency is true, then there's no way we can characterize that knowledge as conceptual, because it is pre-linguistic. So which would mean that we have to redefine our understanding of relationship between concepts and language. So it would have a knock-on effect on certain aspects of standard Buddhist epistemology. Well, one of the positive things, aspects of the Tibetan tradition is that at any given history, there's always a plurality of interpretations. So even of Dhammakirtis, although in principle most Buddhist thinkers would accept Dhammakirtian distinction between perception and conception, but the way in which the distinction is defined and understood may vary from individual to individual and so on. So the fact that there is a divergence of opinion is not really a problem. The problem is whether this empirical finding has a much bigger impact upon the very idea of the distinction. Because this distinction between perception and conception, at least in the Buddhist mind, is an empirically given fact of our mental life. And if the core knowledge hypothesis challenges the very premise, very idea of that distinction, then it could be problematic.